On October 12th, 1492, three ships anchored off a small island in the Bahamas. A crew of 90 men rowed ashore. Their commander, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, believed he had just reached Asia. He hadn't. He wasn't close. But that's not even the strange part. Pull up a chair. The strange part is why he was looking. Columbus wasn't hunting for gold or glory or a new continent. He was hunting for pepper, a specific vine from a specific set of islands, worth more by weight than almost anything else he could have brought home. He never found it. Instead, he found two continents nobody in Europe knew existed, and along the way, he named a completely unrelated fruit after the spice he'd failed to bring back. That name is still on every hot sauce bottle in your kitchen. This is the story of how a spice made people desperate enough that one wrong turn accidentally discovered a hemisphere. To understand why Columbus got on a boat at all, you have to understand what pepper cost in 15th century Europe. A single pound of black pepper in England could run more than 2 days' wages for a skilled craftsman. A full sack, about 70 kilograms, sold in Venice for 30 to 50 ducats. That's roughly a full year's income for that same craftsman. By the time pepper reached a European table, it had passed through so many hands that it could sell for something like 10 times what it cost at its actual source. None of this was really about taste. Pepper preserved meat, covered the smell of food that wasn't fresh, and announced wealth at the table. Owning it said something about you. People weren't just buying a spice, they were buying status they could eat. Pepper didn't come from Europe. It came from India, and from a handful of small volcanic islands near what's now Indonesia, places most Europeans had never seen and couldn't have found on a map. To reach a European kitchen, it traveled by ship across the Indian Ocean, by caravan across the Middle East, through ports run by Arab and Indian merchants, and finally into the Mediterranean, where Italian merchants from Venice and Genoa took over distribution. Every hand it passed through added a markup. Nobody in Europe controlled the supply. Everybody in Europe paid for that. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople, closing off one of the main overland routes spice shipments used to reach Europe. Whatever still came through Ottoman territory now came with a heavier toll attached. Venice already had trade relationships in the region and adapted. Kingdoms without Venice's access got a fresh reason to stop paying middlemen and go get the spice themselves. Portugal had been chipping away at this problem for decades, sending ships further and further down the African coast. In 1488, a Portuguese captain named Bartolomeu Dias finally rounded the southern tip of Africa. A sea route to India was almost within reach. Around this time, a Genoese sailor with no ships of his own, Christopher Columbus, pitched a different idea to the King of Portugal. Skip Africa entirely. Sail straight west across the Atlantic. Since the Earth is round, he argued, sailing west would eventually reach Asia, and the spice markets everyone wanted, faster than sailing all the way around a continent. Portugal's own navigators ran the numbers and turned him down. Their estimate of the distance was close to correct. Columbus's was not. He'd underestimated the size of the globe, overestimated the size of Asia, and leaned hard on a second-hand copy of Marco Polo's travel writing, which described the Indies as bigger and closer than they actually were. By his math, Japan was a few weeks' sail from Spain. In reality, an entire hemisphere he didn't know existed was sitting in the way. Portugal said no. Columbus took his pitch to Spain instead, where King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had just finished the Reconquista and wanted their own way into a trade Portugal was about to dominate. On April 17th, 1492, the two sides signed a contract called the Capitulations of Santa Fe. If Columbus succeeded, he'd become Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of whatever he found. He'd also personally keep 10% of all the gold, silver, pearls, and spices the voyage brought back, forever passed down to his descendants. That's a contract written for a man who was about to bring home pepper, not a new world. On August 3rd, 1492, Columbus left Spain with 3 ships and 90 men, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. On October 12th, after 5 weeks at sea, they sighted land, an island in the Bahamas he named San Salvador. Columbus was certain he'd reach the outer islands of Asia. He spent the following weeks sailing through the Caribbean looking for the 2 things his contract promised him a cut of: gold and the pepper vine that had made the whole trip worth funding. He found some gold. He never found real pepper. Piper nigrum, the actual black pepper plant, is a tropical Old World vine. It has never grown anywhere in the Americas. But on one island, he found something else. A small, fiercely hot fruit the local Taino people used to season their food. He'd come looking for a spicy vine from Asia. He'd found a spicy fruit from a completely different plant family on a completely different continent, related to tomatoes and eggplant rather than to pepper at all. It was hot, though, and Columbus badly needed to have found something. He called it pepper anyway. That mistake never got corrected. The word followed the fruit back to Europe and stuck. It's why English still calls capsicum peppers. It's why the Portuguese word is pimenta and the German word is Pfeffer, both borrowed from the same plant Columbus never actually brought home. Every chili pepper, every bell pepper, every jar of crushed red pepper flakes on a pizza counter is named after a spice it has no botanical relationship to, because one sailor in 1492 needed a win. Columbus made 3 more voyages after the first one, in 1493, 1498, and 1502. On each, he kept searching for a passage through the islands to reach what he believed was the Asian mainland, and kept failing to find the spice trade he'd promised to deliver. He died in Spain on May 20th, 1506, still convinced Cuba was part of the Asian coastline. He never knew what he'd actually found. He never fully collected the 10% his contract promised either. Spain spent decades after his death fighting his heirs over it in court. While Columbus kept insisting he was almost in Asia, Portugal finished the job it had started. In 1498, a Portuguese captain named Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa and landed on the Malabar coast of India. The date was May 20th. That's the same calendar date Columbus would die on, 8 years later, still looking for the place da Gama had already reached. Da Gama came home with a hold full of real pepper and cinnamon, and Portugal spent the next century building an empire on the sea route he'd opened. Spain had funded a voyage that found 2 new continents. Portugal had funded a voyage that found the thing everyone actually wanted. Spain wasn't done. In 1519, a Portuguese captain sailing for Spain, Ferdinand Magellan, set out with 5 ships and about 270 men to find a sea route around South America and reach the actual Spice Islands, the Moluccas, from the west. It was the plan Columbus had been chasing all along, just aimed further south. It went badly. Magellan was killed in the Philippines in 1521. Storms, starvation, and desertion took most of the fleet. In 1522, one ship, the Victoria, limped into a Spanish harbor with 18 surviving men out of the roughly 270 who'd left. In its hold, about 26 tons of cloves, along with smaller amounts of cinnamon and nutmeg worth close to 9 million maravedis. Outfitting all 5 ships at the start of the voyage had cost around 8.5 million. One surviving ship, carrying nothing but spice, paid for an expedition that killed almost everyone who sailed on it, and still turned a profit. Columbus set out to find a shortcut to a plant so valuable that a single cargo hold of it could fund a war fleet and outlive a body count. He never found it. He found 2 continents Europe didn't know were there, misnamed a fruit that had nothing to do with the spice he was chasing, and died believing he'd been right the whole time. The pepper he was promised is still growing on vines in Asia, exactly where it always was. What he actually brought back, an entire hemisphere, and a word that still sits on grocery shelves under the wrong name, turned out to matter more than the thing he was sent to find.